talk tonight about God's invitation. Chris had asked me a couple weeks ago about this parable from Matthew chapter 22, and last week we looked at the parable leading up to this parable, and this parable is actually, according to the commentators I looked at, this parable is two parables in one, so two for the price of one. It's similar to, but different from, the passage in Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14 tells about a banquet and tells about an invitation to the banquet that was rejected by those who were invited. This parable, or these two parables, have a different tone to them than Luke 14. And so we'll take a look at that in page 1289 in your Jeremy Bible. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like." And notice he sets up the parable by saying there's a similarity between what I'm about to tell you and God's kingdom. They're not identical, they're not one and the same, but this is going to help you gain insight into God's kingdom and how God's kingdom operates as opposed to the kingdom of the world. And again, it's similar to Luke 14, but there are different truths being emphasized here. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. So it was going to be about a joyous celebration of a wedding. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come. In that culture, in that time, they didn't have texts, and they didn't have emails, and they didn't have IMs and things. So what they would do when they were to have a party or a banquet or some special occasion was they would receive their invitations, but the invitation was not specific as to the time. And the one who offered the invitation said, I'm going to have this banquet. You're invited to it. When everything is ready, we will let you know. Okay? It seems like an awkward way of doing it compared to the way we do it, but that was the way they did. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. It wasn't that they had reasons not to come, but they refused to come. And so let's think about this, who these characters are. Who is the king in this parable? Big picture. Don't think specifics, think big picture. Who's the king? God's the king. Who are the servants who were sent out to invite people to the banquet? The prophets. Exactly. But they refused to come. Remember what John wrote about Jesus. He came unto his own, but his own rejected him. So God's servants, including his son, had been sent out to invite the Jews to come to the kingdom, come to the banquet. Then he sent some more servants and said, tell those who have been invited, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered. Everything is ready. So he makes this extra effort to invite them. Come to the wedding banquet. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. So they did good things, but they didn't do the best thing. They didn't respond to the invitation. I've got other things I have to do. Or other things I'm choosing to do. Thank you very much. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. Again, the prophets. Prophets were interesting people. You may have heard the phrase, I've heard it recently a number of times from a number of different sources, some politically on the right, some politically on the left. The phrase, speak truth to power. Have you heard that? Speak truth to power. Well, that's what the prophets did. And sometimes the tone was very rancorous, it was very angry, but there's a difference between speaking truth to power and speaking truth in love to power. God's instructing the prophets to speak harshly to the Israelites, or for instance, to David and Nathan when he had sinned. It was always motivated by love, because God's actions are always motivated by love. Even when it seems that God is being harsh and disciplining, the motivation behind the harshness and the anger and the discipline is love. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Now, it's interesting because at least the commentators I looked at, William Barclay being one, believe that when Matthew wrote this, probably 8 to 90 AD, somewhere in that area, he was referring back to something that happened in Jerusalem about 70 AD. Any of you remember what that was? The destruction of the temple. That the Romans finally had had enough of the Jews and their monotheism and their constant rebellions. And so they destroyed the temple in about 70, 73 AD. And so some of these commentators think that that's what Matthew was referring back to. That wasn't Jesus saying this is going to happen, but Matthew kind of writing in basically an interpretation or a commentary, looking back and reporting what had happened. Then he said to the servant, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. Then he says a remarkable thing. Go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you can find. Now, who would fit into that category? If the Jews were the ones who were originally invited, who's the Gentiles, the non-Jews, the people who had no claim on God's grace, like the Jews believed they did, and the people who believed they were excluded from God's kingdom. What Jesus is saying here is, my people were invited. They rejected the invitation. But the banquet is ready. I want the house to be full. Therefore, go to the highways and the byways. Go to those who are outside of the people of God and invite them to come. So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, both good and bad. And this is interesting, too, because the invitation to come is a universal invitation. All, everyone, all who are good and bad. Invite them all to come. That there's a... Many of you listen to country music, Brooks and Dunn. There's an interesting phrase, let's see if I can remember it, an interesting phrase in one of their songs, where they sing, I know the path to heaven is made of sinners and believers. You know, the good and the bad are all invited to come. Now, I don't know which one of those categories you fit into, but it's one of them. You know, it's one of them. It's a universal invitation for all to come. But when the king came in to see the guests, and this is where, somewhere in here is where the second parable picks up. When the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes, who was not prepared for the banquet. And not being prepared for the banquet is as much of an offense as not responding to the invitation to the banquet. Because it meant, well, I don't care, you know. It may be special to him, but it's not special to me. And the clothes, because he asked the question, when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. Friend, he asked, how did you get in here without the wedding clothes? The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, tie him hand and foot, throw him outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many aren't invited, but few are chosen. William Barclay says something interesting about the last part of that parable. The parable has nothing to do with the clothes in which we go to church. It has everything to do with the spirit in which we go to God's house. It is profoundly true that church going must never be about a fashion parade. It's not here. I asked when Al Jason called me about Sunday. I asked him two questions. What time is the service? And what do you want me to wear? Because if it's the first Sunday of the month, like it is when I preach in Naples, that's suit and tie. And so I still don't know what it is. Al was actually no help at all. It is profoundly true that church going must never be a fashion parade. But there are garments of the mind and of the heart and of the soul. The garment of expectation, the garment of humble penitence, the garment of faith, the garment of reverence. And these are the garments without which we ought not to approach God. Too often we go to God's house with no preparation at all. If every man and woman in our congregation came to church prepared for worship, after a little prayer, a little thought, and a little self-examination, then worship would be worship indeed. The worship in which and through which things happen in men's souls and in the life of the church and in the affairs of the world. Now, there's other things about that passage that I'll refer to in a few minutes. I did want to show you Luke chapter 14, and Jesus refers to these responses to the invitation as excuses. And I looked up excuse, a pretext or subterfuge, and that is, it's not valid. You're not telling the truth. You're excusing yourself. You're trying to justify your inattendance. But these are comical compared to this passage in Matthew. These responses are funny. I have bought a field. I must go see it. It sounds like lots in Lehigh or Cape Coral back in the day, doesn't it? Sight unseen. But, you bought a field and you haven't even seen it? How about this one? I have bought 5 yokes of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. That's sort of like saying, I bought a new car and I'm going to go take it for a test drive. Well, what? First you take the test drive, then you buy the car. How flimsy these responses are, how weak they are. The last one is this. The last one is this. I can't go. Why? I just got married, so I can't come. Well, okay. That says something. I don't know what it says, but it says something. One of the things I want you to think about, though, in response to this invitation, and particularly the Matthew passage, I wanted to include this because I just think it's funny. But the Matthew passage is, and these two things, I haven't figured out how they overlap, but historically, there are some church fellowships that over the years have had an opt-out position regarding our faith. A friend of mine was raised in a very Pentecostal, evangelical environment, went to the East Coast of Florida, developed a relationship with an Episcopal minister, and they were talking about infant baptism. And the Episcopal priest said something interesting to him he never thought of. He said, we baptize our infants because that affirms that they are part of the community of faith. And then at some point later in life, confirmation, if they decide not to continue within that community, they can opt out. And fellowships that practice infant baptism, Lutherans and Presbyterians and Episcopalians and others, tend to look at faith that way. You know, you're welcomed in to the faith community, to the community of faith as an infant at baptism, and then at the age of accountability, confirmation, or you decide, no, I choose not to, you opt out. Evangelicals and Pentecostals historically have had an opt-in perspective, and that is you're out until you go forward, until you are baptized as an adult. You are out until you decide you want to be in. Two different ways of looking. And we can see, I think, in this parable, the kind of where they can get that opt-out perspective. That they were invited, they chose not to, they opted out. Okay? Certainly you can say, well, they didn't opt in, you know, but you hear what I'm saying. It's a different way of looking at how we respond to the invitation and whether we're a part of the community of faith and then decide not to, or whether we're outside the community of faith and then we decide to join the faith by becoming a follower of Jesus. I'm not, there are a lot of things, issues that are raised in this parable that I'm not going to begin to try to settle tonight because you don't want to be here that long. They're pretty complex and they're pretty deep, and that's not a cop-out, but it's